Hello, everybody. My name is Bosky. I'm a technical marketing manager at VMware. And today we are going to look at Project Cluster API. This is a project within Kubernetes. Um, and the goal of Cluster API is to provide lifecycle management to bringing up Kubernetes clusters on a cloud provider of your choice. And the way Cluster API does this is it starts with a bootstrap environment, which is a Kubernetes cluster in itself. We call it the management cluster. And once you have the bootstrap or the management cluster created, you can provide Cluster API with different specifications for what you want. For example, what is the provider that you want the cluster to land on, whether it's VMware vSphere, AWS, GCP, or so on and so forth. What kind of cluster do you want, whether the worker nodes and the master node that are created for that cluster, what type they should have, small, medium, large in terms of capacity and sizing. um, how many master and worker nodes do you need, so on and so forth. So you can define very different specifications that are YAML file based. You provide that spec to the cluster API, Kubernetes cluster, and it will start deploying target clusters on the specific cloud provider that you specify. Now, today we are going to walk through a vSphere demo, or walk through the steps needed to bring up a Kubernetes cluster on vSphere using Cluster API. So the first thing is really to getting the management cluster created on vSphere, and the way to go about it is we start with a template that we use to bring up a management cluster on vSphere. This is an OVA image file that we deploy on vSphere. We build the cluster control command, and then we specify the config files needed, and we make and build them. And then finally, we run the clusterctl command with these config files against the management cluster to deploy a new target cluster on vSphere. So with that, let's get started. Now, the first step is to build a management cluster template. So what I have done is I'm going to copy the cluster API vSphere provider repo from GitHub on my laptop. I'm going to go git clone, and if I get into the repo directory, you'll see there's an installer directory which has all the files needed to build the master Kubernetes cluster image files. So I do build as such OVA image. This will start running on my local Docker that's running on my Mac. It will create an image using the Docker runtime and then convert that to an OVA. So I finally have the cluster API vSphere OVA. I'm going to start importing that to vSphere using the Go VC tool, which is a Go SDK for vCenter. You can use, the vCenter web UI if you wish, but I'm just going to use the Go VC. Now, before I import the OVA, I need to update the root password and the SSH keys for that particular image so I know how to log in to the image once it's deployed. So I'm going to edit that file, the OVA file itself, with the root password that I like, and then run the go vc import command to import the OVA in my vCenter. So the vCenter has the imported OVA for the management cluster, and I'm going to power it on now. This will give me my management cluster against which I can run cluster control commands or kube control commands to create further target clusters. So if we log into vCenter, I have a resource pool called management, under which I have the cluster API vCenter virtual machine created. Once the virtual machine is up, you need to capture the kubeconfig file that's located typically in the EDC Kubernetes folder to your laptop so you can run your next command sets against that kubeconfig file. So I'm going to copy that kubeconfig file to my local folder. And now if I just run kubectl against that kubeconfig file, I should be able to see the nodes. Currently it's one. This is a management cluster, and we don't need more worker nodes to that management cluster. Now let's start creating the config files. I can do a make prod YAML, and I'll get some templates that I can reuse in the out folder within the subdirectory that I'm running it in. After I'm done with that, I need to also create or make the clusterctl binary for me to run the CLI for cluster API. So I'm making the clusterctl binary right now. And once that's done, you'll see this clusterctl binary in the cmd command. Now let's look at the config files that we got. So primarily, you'll be needing the cluster machines and the machine set YAML file. Let's look at the cluster YAML file. This file is needed to interface cluster API with your infrastructure provider. In my case, it's vSphere. So I'm going to edit this file to provide the network name, the admin user logon, and so on and so forth to make cluster API aware of my infrastructure provider. The next set of file we'll be adding will be the machines.yaml. The machines.yaml basically talks about what will be your master worker node like, what type will it be, what is your provider that you're using, any specific DNS network names to use, what IP to use. Because this is vSphere, I can also provide specific inventory within vSphere, like which resource pool the master will run into, what template to use for this master node, and a couple of other things like what would be the DNS uh, that the master node will use, and things like that. Similarly, machine-sets.yaml is another file that it's very similar to the machines.yaml, except this will be for your worker nodes. So very similar things. You can define different data stores, different resource pools for your worker nodes to land on. And how many sets of worker nodes do you need? For example, 2, 3, 4. I'll increase my replica set based on that. For now, if you see, I'm running 2 replicas for this cluster. So far we have built the management cluster, deployed it on vCenter, built the clusterctl command, and edited config files. Now finally, let's build the target cluster using all of this. So I'm going to run the clusterctl commands against the admin.conf file, the kubeconfig file for the management cluster, and provide the different YAML files for cluster type, for machine type, and the provider type, using vSphere as my provider. This will start deploying or replicating the templates that I already have in vSphere into building the master node for the Kubernetes cluster. So you'll see it quickly in the vSphere console that a cap PVM machine type has been created using the template that we ran or gave the config files. Once the cluster has been created, or the master node for the cluster has been created, you'll see a kubeconfig file downloaded from the provisioned master node. This kubeconfig file will let us run kubectl against the new target master node created. So we can quickly take a look at what that looks like. You can run kubectl to see the number of nodes. Right now it will show you 1 because we only have deployed a single master node for that cluster. If you look at pods, for all namespaces, you'll see some cluster API components deployed in the cluster API system namespace. Now let's deploy worker nodes. For that, we'll need the machineset.yaml file, and we'll run it against this cluster. So if you look at the number of machines right now for that cluster, it just shows the master node or that we deployed. if you look at the cluster, it is test one. That's the one that we are going to use. Now, if you apply the machine sets.yaml file against this cluster, it will start replicating two more instances, create worker nodes on them, and attach it to this cluster. So we have the new machine set created. If you look at vCenter quickly, you'll see that two virtual machines got replicated from the template to give a total of three virtual machines, one as a master and two worker nodes for that cluster. Now, if you run the number of machines, you'll see the count go from 1 to 3 with the new worker nodes getting added. Let's take a look at the number of nodes now. It might take a little bit of time before the worker nodes get attached and everything is up and running, but you should see that happening within a couple of minutes. So there you have it. All the three nodes ready for the cluster. And it will take a little bit of a time to get them to ready status. Again, a couple of minutes, and the ready status for the worker node should change. Let's run it once more, and there you have it. All status of all the nodes for that cluster is up and running, and we deployed a Kubernetes cluster on vSphere using Cluster API. Thank you.